All right, so part two. Um, a staple of correctional treatment is the use of group therapies. There's some obvious pragmatic reasons for doing that. Biggest is it's cheaper. If you can treat 8 to 10 offenders at the same time with one or two facilitators, that's a lot cheaper than trying to do one-on-one therapy for everybody. Um, And so that's the sort of main, pragmatic reason for doing it. It's more efficient. And so if it's corrections and the government's paying for it, most folks want it to be efficient. In terms of therapy, there's sort of a lot of other benefits for doing it. One of the big ones is that, it's like a classroom in the sense that exchanges between one therapist and one client might actually be useful for everybody else in the group. So when a student asks a question, oftentimes it's the same question that a bunch of other people are thinking about but don't ask. So it's a useful way to do that sort of thing. Second, the book lists a bunch of them. If you look at, I think it's page 85, page 86, maybe that's the old book. Let's see. It's earlier. Huh. It's right on the first page 83. The information is a big one. Development of social skills is a big one. So if you're using groups, it's a good opportunity to do role modeling, to practice new skills. You get feedback from the people in the group, and offenders can sort of role play in a more realistic way than a therapist might. You can imitate the behaviors of other people that are doing well in the group. And so you sort of harness that tendency to imitate and to learn from peers. And so that's another big reason why groups are so popular in corrections. One of the examples we're talking about sex offending, of the use of groups is that they'll use sex offending groups to sort of break down rationalizations and denials. So when you come into a group, they'll say, introduce yourself, say why you're here. And invariably, when you're talking about, why am I in a sex offending group, people tend to minimize, they'll tend to deny, they'll tend to sort of reframe the crime that got them there. And what they don't know is that all the other offenders in the group have already read the police report, they've already read the victim impact statement, and so they're able to sort of call BS on those rationalizations and excuses. And that's pretty powerful coming from sort of other folks as opposed to police, courts, judges, other people in power. Offenders can recognize those rationalizations, and it's good for them to sort of see what it looks like when other people try to do that and to minimize. So in terms of its effectiveness, my sense of the literature is that group in and of itself doesn't seem to make much of a difference. What seems to matter is what you do. So you can sort of stream through a group the same sort of treatments that you do on a one-on-one basis. And in that sense, like, what you do is important. The meta-analyses that look at was it a group or not find that it doesn't matter. So in that sense, it's cheaper, it has benefits, and doesn't seem to sort of hurt the effectiveness. There is a whole literature on this. If you take a counseling class, if you're going to run a group, it's worth looking into. The consensus seems to be like 8 to 10 folks that's the most effective for running a group. If you get too few, you sort of lose the benefit of the group. It becomes less efficient. People are afraid to speak up. If you have too many, people can kind of hide, and they don't feel like they need to contribute. And so the sort of 10 is like the rough ballpark. Another issue is to have the group open-ended or closed-ended. So my example of the sex offenders would be an open-ended group where new people coming in are sort of grilled and by the folks that have been there and already been trained on, recognizing excuses and denials and those sorts of things. So, the benefit of open-ended is that the more experienced group members can sort of help with the less experienced group members. Obviously, with a problem with open-ended is that you're sort of constantly going back and rehashing, right? Like if anybody could join a classroom, to stay with that metaphor, right? How would you teach a class where people are constantly joining and they don't have the background and they have to keep catching up? And so the benefit of a closed group where everybody starts at the same spot is that you can sort of move through whatever course material you have, whatever group material you have together. Um, and people sort of can form a bond and care about each other, and then the group becomes closer, and that can be therapeutic. So there's sort of benefits and drawbacks to doing each. And again, I don't think the literature is real clear that one works better or worse than others. So as with the other part of this is that in this chapter, they sort of mix in some sort of older, less effective group methods, and there's some group methods that sort of work but have been modified. One of the old ones that we don't do is referred to as psychodrama, and it's consistent with that insight-oriented stuff and person-centered stuff, and that the client gets to act out whatever part of their life they feel is important, and so usually it's some aspect of their life, their regret, things they could do over, things they felt like they've been abused or mishandled. And the idea is that the client essentially creates a play, and then other people in the group act as actors, and the counselor act as a director. Probably really effective and appropriate for offenders, and for the same reasons that they're going to pick stuff that doesn't necessarily relate to crime and use it as a way to sort of excuse and minimize behavior. And it's very much not part of the here and now that tends to work with offenders. Guided group interaction, it's a bit like reality therapy that I talked about earlier. The idea was sort of sound and based on theory, in that you're trying to harness the pressure of one of the biggest correlates of crime, and that's peer pressure. That people who hang around with delinquent peers feel pressured to try and they're rewarded for delinquency. So the idea is, well, let's harness that and use peers to sort of push people in a more positive direction. And so, as with some of the inside stuff, the staff are supposed to back off and be facilitators rather than therapists or counselors. That is, they were just there to kind of help guide the group as opposed to lead the group. And then the group was supposed to be, their own leaders, have their own autonomy, set up their own rules, enforce their own rules. You can probably imagine yourself what would happen if you took a bunch of, 13 to 17-year-old delinquent kids that were in an institution and said, you know what, set up your own rules and then enforce them however you want. It tends to end up with kids sort of ankle biting each other and trying to catch each other and coming up with sort of more and twisted punishments, and it tended to be very negative and very counterproductive. And so it was revised into something called positive peer culture that is still used by a fair number of juvenile institutions. The early sort of results on PPC was pretty much the same as the GGI, the guided group interaction, that it was not working and it might make kids worse. More recent studies since the 90s suggest that kind of if you do it right and you have really well-trained facilitators that sort of can distinguish between kids trying to do the right thing and kids just sort of making power plays and trying to mess with each other, that it can work. We'll talk about a couple examples of using peer groups in that sense. It's a lot more guided than the guided group stuff was. The therapist has to take on a bigger role in the positive peer culture. They have to do a lot more guiding and teaching than they did in the old one. So we'll talk a bit about that positive peer culture. It's a part of sort of a wider net of therapies that tend to work. Therapy community, we talked about a bit earlier. That's the idea that you sort of wall off. Either you do the whole institution, so if you do juvenile institution, it's sort of the whole thing would be built on the PPC, the positive peer culture, or a token economy, or something like that. And the idea is that everybody, there are no custody people, that everybody is treatment oriented. All the staff are trained on what you're trying to do and why this stuff is important and how to do the treatment. and all the inmates, offenders are supposed to be also sort of helping each other. And so the idea is 24/7, that you're getting treatment as opposed to, 1.5 hour of treatment in prison that is like 23.5 hours of custody and pain. Early versions of this, they tried, for example, like Wings of a Prison, where again, they gave the inmates a lot of autonomy. And as you might expect, when you do that, things can go bad. It turned into almost like little cult-like organizations where the inmates would make all these demands, and the inmates get to make up the rules, and they get to punish people. Shave your head and talk a certain way, and behave a certain way, and dress a certain way, and it tended not to work well. And again, like other stuff, since the late 80s, early 90s, it's one of those therapies that if you do it right, it can work. And it's like group therapy generally, in that you can do therapeutic community, you can do milieu therapy with any sort of style of treatment. So you can do a cognitive behavioral therapy in a whole juvenile institution where it's a milieu, where the whole institution is run by this cognitive behavioral stuff. And so it tends to depend on what you do rather than how you do it. So there are some milieu programs out there that do very well, because they tend to do things that work and target things that are related to crime. And if you don't, you're not going to get good results. So that's it. That went a lot quicker than I thought it was going to go. Enjoy your week off. Hopefully, I'll see you next week.